You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast featuring some of Indiana's most fascinating men and women whose impact has shaped our state, our communities, and us. Join us as we discuss their imprint on our history. Leaders and Legends is brought to you by Veteran Strategies Incorporated, your local veteran business enterprise specializing in public relations, media relations, public outreach, crisis communications, and digital photography. My name is Robert Vane, Principal of Veteran Strategies, former Deputy Chief of Staff to Mayor Greg Ballard, and Communications Director for the Indiana Republican Party. I'm honored to be your host for our discussion. You're listening to Leaders and Legends. This is Robert Vane. Leaders and Legends is presented by Veteran Strategies Incorporated and sponsored by the Girl Scouts of Central Indiana. Our guest today is David Frick, former Deputy Mayor for William Hudnut and the man, according to P.E. McAllister and according to Mark Miles, who is responsible for the Indianapolis Colts. So, Mr. Frick, thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
Are you from Indianapolis originally?
I went to high school in Indianapolis, but I really grew up near Fort Wayne.
Which high school did you go to?
Southport High School. I'm a South Sider, which is relatively rare.
I think that is relatively rare. That's right. How did that shape your worldview as opposed to probably a lot of the people you worked with as your career grew were from North Side or different places?
Well, I was blessed. I grew up in Northeast Indiana, as I mentioned, and it was a typical farming community. My grandparents' farms where I spent most of my time growing up. And when I came to the big city of Indianapolis, it was a little bit of an eye-opening experience to go from a town of 3,000 people to 750,000 people gave me a very different perspective on what it's like to live and work. Southport High School at the time there wasn't a lot of development down on the south side. The real development impetus was always to the north and the northeast. Yet I was very comfortable going to high school at Southport. Life really revolved around the schools back then, unlike today. We would go to dances around at the school. There would be all the parties at the school, all different kinds of clubs at the school that you would have an opportunity to be involved.
May I ask what year you graduated?
1962.
And so Perry Meridian was 15 years in the future, and so everybody was going.
Everybody in the South Side. And if you talk to the long-term South Siders, they'll tell you that it probably was a mistake to create Perry Meridian, that there was projections on growth that really never materialized. And there was clearly room to have one little bit larger high school as opposed to two high schools, both of which were not quite as big as they needed to be.
From Southport, you attended IU, is that correct?
That is correct, from 1962 through 1966.
Tell me about going to law school at Harvard. The Southport to Harvard pipeline, I can only imagine, was not very big.
Relatively rare, I would say.
What is it about Harvard that attracted you?
Well, if you can get into Harvard legitimately.
That's a good point these days. Correct. Legitimately.
It's quite an eye-opening experience. I had the blessings of being married when I went to Harvard. So I had a spouse who was very supportive of the incredibly long hours I put in.
How long have you been married?
We've been married 54 years.
For those of you who are wondering why there's silence, Mr. Frick is looking for confirmation from his wife, who's giving him the thumbs up. Did you meet anyone famous when you were at Harvard?
Oh, sure. It's one of the advantages of going to Harvard or Yale or any of the schools along the East Coast is that there are people from very important families who have fathers or mothers who were successful in the business arena, the not-for-profit arena, or the political arena. And so you have an opportunity to interact and get to know, at one time, maybe a half dozen of my law school classmates who had gone on to legal careers, or in politics, or worked for the Defense Department, worked for the White House. So,
when year did you graduate from law school?
1969.
Any of your friends or acquaintances caught up in Watergate?
No, but one almost did. Had the opportunity to work for Haldeman and in the executive office, and fortunately it didn't materialize. Did you take classes with any future Supreme Court justices or any other names?
Yeah, Stephen Breyer, who's on the Supreme Court now. So Justice Breyer, appointed by Bill Clinton, I believe.
I think that's correct. And I think he is the only one. The current Supreme Court has 6 people who are graduates of Harvard on the Supreme Court. Justice Breyer was the only one I was exposed to.
Do you see folks like that when you go back? I mean, I'm trying to think of anyone else I know prominent in Indiana, went to Harvard. Luke Kinley would be the one that I would think of.
Luke and I overlapped.
So you knew Luke?
I didn't know him, but he was at the business school at the time I was at the law school, or maybe he was a year or two after when he came to the law school.
Because I know he also served in the military,
yes,
as I recall. So you leave Harvard. What's your next step? How'd you get back to Indianapolis?
Well, it's kind of a convoluted way to get back to Indianapolis. Upon graduation, I had a commission to go into the Army in the JAG Corps. And if you remember, that was the height of the Vietnam controversy. And so I was thinking only in terms of a limited engagement. Lo and behold, the Army decided they didn't need any more lawyers, and which didn't break my heart, except I was going to be subject to a draft then. And I was fortunate that my number in the draft wasn't called.
Do you remember your draft number?
No, but it was pretty high. I do remember that. And so, because I would have enjoyed serving in the military as a lawyer, it would have been a great training ground for me. I didn't particularly want to be a grunt soldier.
That's understandable.
Those guys, what they faced is just incredible.
But you came back to Indianapolis.
Well, there was an interim step. I had the opportunity. I interviewed the large firms in Boston, New York, and Chicago, and ended up going to work for a large firm, Mayer, Brown and Platt, in Chicago. And after a year and a half there, they asked me to move to Washington, D.C., along with a partner, and we recruited some young lawyers to join the office there and to set up an office for Mayer Brown in Washington, D.C. And that's where I really had developed an interest in politics.
Is the Harvard degree, I mean, do they, obviously I'm unaware, does the Harvard degree do they come running? I mean, was it like, once you graduate from here, don't worry about a job, these law firms are going to be all over you, you're just going to have your pick?
Well, I think it does open a lot of doors, but most of my classmates deserve to have doors open. They were very talented people. And people have often asked me, what is it that struck you the most about your Harvard experience? It was the incredible brilliance of my classmates. And I've been blessed with, I think, a pretty good mind, but I realized that regardless of how hard I worked, I could never compete intellectually with some of my classmates and some of my professors. They were just very, very brilliant people.
Was there the sense then, and then we'll move on, Harvard, Ivy League schools in general, take a beating these days for what's called grade inflation. Everyone gets an A. Was that your experience?
Well, the law school was not that way. I graduated with honors, and there was a pretty small group of people who got the honors, graduated with honors. I did experience it in the undergraduate school. I taught at Harvard College when I was in law school. I taught in the course in expository writing. Mm-hmm. And there I noticed there's a lot of pressure because of the professors worrying about some of the students if they flunked out. There was grade inflation that was going on. Now, I don't know how long it continued, but there were in my class, there were very few students who didn't get a good grade because that was the way we were expected to grade.
How much was your college experience like the movie Animal House? It was about the same decade, around the same time period?
Well, that was a classic movie. Everybody, 20 or 30 times I saw the movie. But that was not my experience. My family couldn't help me go to school. And so I had to collect scholarships and I had to work when I was a student. I started out washing pots and pans in a fraternity house and moved up to be a waiter and then moved up to be a breakfast cook. So I was working 20 or 25 hours a week as an undergraduate. And I was fortunate I met my current wife my freshman year, and we were not big in the party scene. So Animal House couldn't be further from my experience.
Everybody I know who's gone to Bloomington would go back there tomorrow. Everyone raves about the experience. Would you put yourself in that category?
I do. It was a great place to develop a relationship with faculty members. I had a couple of faculty members who took a very intense interest in me. One was James Kessler, who was known for his work in analyzing the decision-making process in government. And the other one was Charles Heinemann, who was a classic political scientist known for years and years. And I had worked enough took a pretty heavy load in addition to working full time. And so by my senior year, I didn't need any credits and I couldn't leave school. Or excuse me, let me rephrase that. I had an opportunity to study as an independent study with Dr. Heinemann because I had finished all my coursework and was out of taking classes. And I thoroughly enjoyed and developed a lot of research papers working with him. And so I had a real, for the first time in my life, exposure to a very brilliant person, developing a work product that I could make a small contribution, realizing that the real work and intellectual capacity came from that professor.
Did you know, speaking of famous people, I guess, they don't all go to Harvard. Did you meet any people down in Bloomington who you would later work with there in Indianapolis? Jim Morris, Ed Tracy, Jim Kittle, Harry Gonzo. There's a lot of good people.
You're mentioning people that I know well from my experience. I'll just give you a couple of vignettes. Jim Kittle went to Pike High School, and I went to Southport High School. And we both went to Indianapolis-based, which was an American Legion program to teach young leaders. And I ran for governor. I was involved in Southport High School in a variety of community activities, was student council president at Southport. And Kittle was my campaign manager. And I got thoroughly crushed in the election. And I tell everybody I had a very poor campaign manager. And Kittle's retort has been for years, I had to deal with an incompetent politician as a candidate.
So when he took over State Party, when he became chairman in 2001, 2002, did you think it was the doom of the Indiana Republican Party?
Yeah, I did. But Jim really did a nice job.
Terrific, actually, terrific.
And the really important one, though, is Jim Morris. Jim and I got to know one another on the IU's campus. And as I'll go back and tell you how I got to Indianapolis, it's kind of a long, convoluted way of getting back. But that's where I developed a friendship with Jim. And then there were a variety of other people who when you went to IU, you had doors open for you in Indiana politics.
Sure.
But the relationship with Jim was one that I've treasured over the years because he basically convinced me to come back to Indianapolis.
Was he chief of staff to Mayor Lugar at the time?
Yeah, he was. And there was a way I got to know Dick Lugar. is Jim Morris and I were at some cocktail function in Washington, D.C., and he was out there with Dick Lugar, and I went to this cocktail party, and our paths crossed. And he said, "I want you to meet somebody." And I didn't. He said, "I'm not going to tell you who it is, but come to breakfast the next morning." And it was at the Madison Hotel in Washington, D.C., and it was Dick Lugar. And I was so impressed with Lugar, and we had a very engaging conversation. And Lugar said, "Young man, you need to come home."
What year would this have been?
Roughly? That would have been 1971, probably late 70, early 71. And it caused me to start thinking seriously about coming back to Indianapolis. And fortunately, Jim's reconnection with him brought me back here. And so I've always been indebted to Jim for convincing me to come back.
Well, I mean, Mr. Morris is going to be on this podcast. He's been very kind to me. And I mean, Jim Morris's career is modern Indianapolis. And those are one of the things I want to talk to him about. You're listening to Leaders and Legends, presented by Veteran Strategies and sponsored by the Girl Scouts of Central Indiana. Our guest today is David Frick, graduate of Harvard Law School, former deputy mayor for William Hudnut. 75, Richard Lugar decides he cannot run for a third term, so his time as mayor ends, and this fellow named Bill Hudnut decides to run for mayor. Hudnut was elected to Congress in 72, defeating Andy Jacobs, and then lost in 1974 to Andy Jacobs in the rematch. How well did you know Mayor Hudnut, Bill Hudnut?
Well, I got to know
before he became mayor, I guess.
Yeah, I was going to say, I really got to know Bill in his congressional campaign. I had just moved back here from Washington, D.C., and he, I guess I can't quite recall how we made contact with one another, but we hit it off. And so I worked on the issue side of that campaign, wrote speeches, press releases, developed policy statements, and became very, very fond of Bill. And that was a major upset when he beat Andy Jacobs. 2 years later, the people in Indianapolis wanted him back to come home.
Watergate didn't help.
Well, that was
because Lugar lost to Bai in a whisker. Even despite Watergate, he came close, and then Lugar wins election to the Senate in 76
against Harkey. Mm-hmm. No, it was in you could tell it in the people's eyes when I would stop in polling places, and people had made up their mind they were not going to tolerate Watergate criminals, and so they had a mission. And it resulted in Andy Jacobs being reelected. The good news is that Bill Hudnut and Andy Jacobs developed a very close relationship. If you study their campaign, there wasn't negative talk on the part of either one of them.
Well, before we started recording today, I relayed a story that Andy Jacobs told me at lunch. He said, I can't remember if before one of their debates, whether Hudnut picked Andy up or Andy picked Hudnut up, and they rode together where they were going to debate each other. Could you imagine that these days?
Well, no. I mean, it was a different era with different people. And unfortunately, many of the political leaders we have today couldn't do that.
Well, one of our podcasts previous with John Mutz and Louis Mahern, they had a terrific friendship that lasts to this day. It was an amazing discussion about just working together. Well,
this is kind of jumping ahead, but if there's a secret to the success of those days in Indianapolis, it was people worked together. They didn't care what party label was attached, and there were many Democrats who helped carry the Hudnut platform and do things to revitalize our city. It wasn't a labor issue or it wasn't a corporate issue. People just worked together, and that's what's been lost. The concept of compromise, and you no longer hear people talk about it.
You're listening to Leaders and Legends, brought to you by Veteran Strategies Incorporated and sponsored by the Girl Scouts of Central Indiana. We're here with David Frick. In 1975, Bill Hudnut as elected mayor beats Bob Welch. When did you start working for him?
not until 1976. I'll come back to that in a second. Bill asked me to help develop the transition plan from Luger to Bill Hudnut. And he wanted me to come to be part of his administration, and I wasn't anxious to do that. But as I was working on the transition itself, I caught the bug and agreed to come in and to work for him. And it's probably the best decision I've ever made, other than when my wife and I got married.
You came in at a time on the cusp of several significant events, certainly one or two of them watershed events in the city's history. So let me kind of ask you about them very quickly. If I have my dates correct, it's July of 1977, the Pacers telethon. What was that like? I remember the Pacers, and I was born in 67. I can remember the Pacers and the ABA a little bit. I remember the telethon really, really well. But the notion of a telethon to save an NBA franchise, I don't know if it's been done before or since.
It was a unique experience. Hudnut asked me to deal with a lot of my time on economic development issues. Now, I had some of the departments of government reported up to me, and others reported to Joe Slash or Tom Hasbrook before Joe. But Bill really said, I want you to help develop this economic development strategy. And so that at that time, it meant working with the Pacers. The Pacers were in the old ABA. They were one of 4 teams that were admitted into the NBA, but the NBA extracted an incredible pain for those four franchises coming into the NBA.
Denied them fee and no TV revenue
and no TV revenue. And so every year they would sell their season tickets, use the money immediately to pay off all the bills they'd run up for the prior year, and then struggle to figure out how they could operate for another year. And so after a couple of years of being exposed to that, and they really were going to be moving out of town, had we not done some form of raising the number of season ticket sales. And so that was something that was proposed. I can't remember whether it was Bobby Leonard or his wife, but somebody proposed the idea.
Mayor Hudnut was an active participant. He just didn't stand aside and say, everybody do this. He was intimately involved.
Very much so. And we pulled it off. There was a number we set for the number of season tickets that we had to sell. I think it was more of a goal than an actual requirement.
8,000?
Yeah, I think it was around 8,000. And we did it. And Nancy Leonard really, Bobby's wife, did a wonderful job putting that together.
6 months after the Pacers telethon, recall what hit Indianapolis?
It's called the Blizzard.
The Blizzard of 78 hit in January. I don't know if I was 3rd grade, 4th grade. What I remember about it, we ask you from your perch on 25. It's funny because you and I had the exact same office.
Oh, really?
On the 25th floor, yes. And that is, it was the only time they closed school for 2 days at one. Like, school's closed this day and the next day. You don't even have to ask. Like, it was so bad that they closed school for 2 days in a row at the same time. That's what I remember about it. I also remember Hudnut in the Racers. So this is your opportunity to take credit for Bill Hudnut wearing the Racers cap as he reassures the city that everything's going to be okay.
Well, there are 2 or 3 stories coming out of that experience. Ann and I went to the IRT that night. But earlier that day, Hudnut had airplane tickets to fly to Washington, D.C. Or, excuse me, it was the next day after when Ann and I went to the IRT. And he was scheduled to fly to his first state dinner, and he and his wife were really looking forward to that. And unfortunately, I was the bearer of the news. Bill, you can't go. We got a blizzard. We didn't know it was a blizzard. We just knew that there was a lot of snow coming, and you can't be caught out of town. And the reason we said that is because earlier he was in San Francisco when we had an ice storm and got a lot of heat for running around across the country when he should be home worrying about moving the snow. And he got very irritated with me. He threatened to fire me but I had the tickets and I wouldn't give him the tickets.
You had the actual plane tickets?
I had the plane tickets. And I'm embellishing a little bit, but he realized it was a thing to do to stay here. So when the snow turned into a blizzard, he was in a unique position to take advantage of it politically. Now, Joe Slash and I were focused on dealing with the emergencies. I mean, think about the number of people who were on medicines. How do they get their medicine? Or people that were on therapies. How do they take their therapies? Because the city was totally closed down. We even pulled all the police officers in from the streets. And we didn't have any crime, interestingly enough. I guess even thieves knew wasn't a very good idea to go outside. But how Bill got the racer hat it was kind of an interesting story. Like I said, Joe Slash and I were focused on just getting things moving again. Bill was playing a very important role, and that was a reassurance role. And so he said, I'm going to go out and ride with the DOT drivers. And Slash and I applauded that to get him out of our hair because there were important things to do. But he's dressed
6'5", 6'6", so this hat makes him almost 6'10", 6'9".
And people wanted reassurance that we're going to get through it. And Bill was very good at communicating that. And the way he did it was amazing. He wore the same sweater. He wore the same cap. Now, people would see the same thing day after day, and they think, well, he's spending all of his time here, doesn't even have time to go home, change clothes. Well, he did go home and change clothes, but put the same ones back on.
I can feel your pain on the tickets. Remember, it was 2009 Final Four. Ballard gets mugged. Do you remember that?
We were there up in Detroit.
I'm the one who convinced him not to take security. I said, nobody knows who the hell you are up there. You don't need to take security. It's just a waste of taxpayer money. You'll be in and out. Don't worry about it. And it was a bit of a fight. And then I'm still convinced to this day it was staged. He was never actually mugged. Well, Mayor, if you're listening, I believe it's staged.
Well, we knew about it because what happened was the police officers on the Saturday game, the police officers in Detroit were mad about something. And so they quit directing traffic. And there was this incredible tie-up of nobody could move who was in a car. Ann and I were up there because I was involved with the NCAA in the Final Fours. And we finally gave up and got off the bus and to walk back to the hotel. And it was scary. After we had done that, we thought, we're fools. Because we walked right through where Ballard was walking when he got mugged.
Yeah, I got some I told you so's pretty bad. Actually, maybe last to this day. Because I never should listen to you on anything, especially security for the Detroit Final Four. You were also in the mayor's office, as we move on, when the Richard Hall, Tony Kiritsis incident happened. Actually, Richard Hall has agreed to come on the Leaders and Legends podcast, and I'm looking forward to that because I can remember that as a kid, mostly because of the profanity from Kiritsis, which was aired on live television. But just the whole event, what was that like when you were trying to figure out or help figure out how to save this man's life? Because that was ultimately the goal. Yeah,
I think we listened to the professionals on what to do with the emergency. And so the police department was heavily involved. Fred Heckman, radio announcer or newsman, was heavily involved. But the pros knew what they were doing, and they gave the the advice, but it was weird to see a guy with a shotgun with tape to his neck and walking around in the downtown.
Indianapolis in the 70s was, despite all the, I must say, miraculous work of the Lugar administration with Unigov and building the Market Square Arena downtown, it was really its formative years. And then Mayor Hudnut, along with others, of course, but ultimately it was his decision, decided to do something that remains almost a focal point of our history in an unprecedented event, I think, in modern history, municipal history, and that is build an NFL-ready stadium when the city has no NFL team. You were involved from alpha to omega in everything and during that time period. Was that his idea that he brought to others, or did others bring that idea to him and then he championed it?
I think it was a combination of both. There's a story on how we ended up with an NFL franchise that's important to understand why the building was built. A local citizen by the name of Bob Welsh, who actually ran against Bill Hudnut for mayor, had been working with the NFL trying to build support for Indianapolis as a place to have an NFL expansion franchise. And Hudnut had asked me to work with the football-focused people, including Bob Welsh. And so it became clear that we were not going to be able to get a franchise without a stadium. The concept Bob Welsh had was modernize Butler Stadium. Well, that was never going to work.
Because the NFL expanded, I think, at 77. That's Seattle and Tampa Bay. But at the time that you're talking about, teams were moving from Los Angeles to St. Louis, and the Raiders, probably most famously.
They couldn't decide between Oakland and L.A. They moved back and forth. So that threw a wrench into what we were trying to do, which was to convince the NFL to bring an expansion franchise. We realized that if we're going to get an expansion franchise, it was going to be because we have a stadium. Now, the reason that it made sense to build the stadium was obviously the hope someday of getting an NFL franchise. But Hudnut had committed to developing convention and tourisms as one of the major impetuses for economic development. And that we needed to expand our convention center. And so it was easy if we could attach the stadium to the convention center, then we'd have multiple use, a couple 100 days a year. And that's really what made that project possible. People had proposed building a stadium on, essentially where the Victory Field is now located, and that as a standalone stadium, or on the other side of White River. And I wrote a memo to Hudnut saying this doesn't work. You're only talking NFL 12 games. You got to have something else. But by connecting the stadium to the Hoosier Dome to the convention center, the economics worked. And so then it was a political risk, not an economic risk, of building something that looked like a stadium, even though it's part of the convention center. And had we not pulled off, and that just took guts on Hudnut's part.
Were there naysayers? Were there people in the room going, "You can't be serious, Bill"?
Probably the leading naysayer was a guy by the name of Tom Binford, who was Mr. Community Citizen. But people
Really? Binford? That's interesting, because he was known as such a forward, strategic thinker.
Yeah, he was, on this one, he was not. Ask your friend P. McAllister sometime.
I will. Did the Colts get identified quickly as a possible relocation franchise?
The answer is no. Again, I was working with a group of citizens here in town who were trying to figure out how we could convince the NFL to award an expansion franchise. Unfortunately, expansion franchises were put on hold because of the mobility or movement of these franchises, existing franchises between town and the NFL trying to get control of it and being fought in court by primarily the Raiders.
This is the famous Pete Rozelle, Al Davis feud.
And we had been trying to develop a good working relationship with the NFL. I can't tell you how many times I flew to New York and met with them on an issue or two on the design of the stadium. Some reason to get in front of them. We finally got this top staffers in the NFL to come out for events, the 500-mile race.
Oh, sure. And then it's in its heyday, so you could prove that you could put on big events, the biggest in the world.
And so we were working to build that expansion franchise. When we, at the Super Bowl, and I want to say it was in the 1994 Super Bowl, Tom Shine, who helped build a company called Logo 7 in our town, heard that Bob Irsay was starting to look around for a new home for the Baltimore franchise.
So the 84 Super Bowl.
84 Super Bowl, excuse me. And so he brought that to his boss, Herb Simon, or his good friend Herb Simon, who then called Hudnut and myself and told us. And so then we reached out to the Colts and say, hey, if you're thinking about relocating, we've got a brand new stadium that's almost done, and why don't you come out and take a look? And that started a process that took about 6 weeks from the time we started until they got in the moving vans and came to Indianapolis.
Do you believe the Colts, let me say that differently, do you believe Baltimore would have seized the team through eminent domain?
Well,
because that was the threat, and I think that was the proximate catalyst to them calling, saying, come get us. Is that correct?
That's correct. And it's interesting that you recognize that. I don't think Irsay would have moved the Colts, even though the NFL was putting a lot of pressure on him to do so. Had the legislature violated a promise they made to Bill Hudnut, to Bob Irsay, which was that we will not use eminent domain to acquire the Colts franchise. And they started a legislative process in which they suspended rules and passed in one house the bill unanimously, and then they did the same thing the next day. And Irsay picked up the paper and saw that and said, I got to get out before the Colts are seized through eminent domain. And I think Baltimore would have done that. And so they really forced him to leave.
Do you think the fact that you had a Harvard law degree helped you connect with the NFL and Baltimore and the East Coast folks, whereas if you'd had a law degree from Iowa State or New Mexico State, that maybe they would have looked at you a little differently? Do you think that gave you some credibility?
Oh, it may have.
I'm giving it to you. Yeah, so, do you want to take it?
I wouldn't. No, I don't think. I think anybody who was a deal maker, and I was a deal maker, I knew how to put significant transactions together, both as a lawyer and when I was in government. So that was the more important thing, is how you try to get people to come to an agreement. And we were able to do that because Mr. Irsay relied upon his attorney, Michael Chernoff, to do a lot of the heavy lifting on terms of location. And I developed a close relationship with Mike Chernoff in this process. And there was a lot of uncertainty on the part of our side. Is he trying to use us to get a better deal someplace else?
Sure.
And on their side, will we really deliver what we're promising? And I think we got through almost all those issues because Mike Chernoff and I just understood one another. And we concluded by working together, we can craft an agreement that will work for Mr. Irsay and work for the city of Indianapolis.
Who got to call Mayor Hudnut and say, they're coming?
Well, there are two calls. Michael Chernoff called me and said, we got to get out of Baltimore, and describe what the legislature was doing. And Bob Irsay called Bill Hudnut and said essentially the same thing. And so Michael Chernoff flew down to Indianapolis. We had some paperwork we had to get cleaned up. And then he got on a plane and flew to Baltimore. And middle of the night, they started moving.
When you see an image of the Mayflower trucks, what does that bring back to you in terms of like the memories of the process and how the city came together? Like whatever you need. It's like whatever you need. No questions. Just tell me what you need.
Well, the Mayflower move was one where Bill Hudnut's next door neighbor was Johnny B. Smith, who was the CEO of Mayflower. And Johnny B. in one of his pontifications said, well, if you want to move the Colts to Indianapolis, I'll move them free. And so Hudnut called him and said, guess what? You get to move them free.
And how did you keep the secret? How long before the phone calls that you described took place before it got out?
Well, it got out when they started pulling trucks at the Colts headquarters. But I think before then, no one in Baltimore knew. And there were only a handful of us in Indianapolis who knew what was going on. In the middle of the night, which is undercover darkness, you hear that used a lot, was simply a product of time. Michael Chernoff had to leave Chicago, get on the company plane, fly to Indianapolis. We had, like I said, a lot of paperwork we had to clean up. And by the time we got that done, he got on the plane and flew to Baltimore. It was starting to be 8 or 9 o'clock. And so that was simply a product of the way the event unfolded, because there was no real issue of trying to sneak out in the middle of the night. It just, the time worked out the way it worked out.
Is it true or apocryphal that Bob Irsay, the then owner of the Colts, looked at the color scheme inside the then Hoosier Dome before it became the RCA Dome and said, these are the Colts colors. Maybe this is meant to be.
That's how I've described it. Those words have come from me. I was the person who took Bob Irsay over to the stadium, and we walked into the stadium, and Bob Irsay was never quiet. He talked all the time, and he became very quiet. And I was puzzled. And I said, are you okay? And he said, I look at the silver upper deck bench seats. I look at the white roof. I look at the lower deck blue seats. Those are the Colts colors. It's meant to be. And I knew at that point, it was simply a question of
that he wasn't using you as a bargaining chip.
We could get this deal done.
Before the Colts came, the then Hoosier Dome had the world's biggest basketball game with the Olympic team coached by Bobby Knight playing some NBA players. And it had a Notre Dame Purdue college game. And I think it had a Chicago Bears, Buffalo Bills, maybe preseason game. My family was one of the teams that won, one of the families won the lottery, the initial ticket lottery for the Colts. What was it like for you? I'm assuming you attended when you took your seat for the very first home game of the Indianapolis Colts.
Well, I'm glad you emphasized Indianapolis, because that's one thing we wrote in the agreement. We wanted it to be the Indianapolis Colts. Well, you're overwhelmed. I mean, you sit there and you think about how fortunate we were that it all worked out. And my wife had to pinch me more than once just to keep me from drifting off, because this was a very compressed period of time of 6 weeks and it really was several years if you think about when we started working on trying to attract not an existing team, but getting awarded an expansion franchise to the day that we're playing NFL football in Indianapolis. It was also a personally difficult time for me. My daughter was diagnosed with a ruptured appendix, and she was in pretty bad shape. And so Ann, my wife, was staying with her overnight, staying with her all the time. And I would try to come by, but again, I was immersed in doing this deal. And the deal communications occurred in a variety of locations all over the United States. I mean, I met Bob Irsay and Mike Chernoff at the NFL owners meeting in Hawaii. We met in in Chicago. We met in Indianapolis. And so all that build up and all these strings being pulled, when it came time to have the CIB bless the agreement formally, I choked up. I couldn't talk. I had tears running down my cheeks.
Well, and that's one of the things when you work sure, it's other offices too, but when you work in the mayor's office, and I've had other people who've worked in different administrations say, I drive past this or I visit X and remember how much I was involved. For me, it's getting the alley paved behind the McGinley's Golden Ace on the east side. That doesn't quite compare to bringing an NFL team here.
We all know better than that. I got boots on. You could be.
What was it then like? You were involved with the building of what became Lucas Oil Stadium. What was it like for you when you saw the RCA Dome being torn down?
It broke my heart. That was a great building. People forget that we built that on the cheap. Interest rates at that time were 13.5%. And so that limited the amount of money.
It was built 82, 83, 84-ish.
Yes.
Cost about 60, 65, 70 million, maybe?
The number they used, that involved an expansion of the convention center as well as the Hoosier Dome. The Hoosier Dome, part of it was about 55 million. And then the rest was the expansion of the convention center. But it was, just a lot of memories.
Do you have a piece of it somewhere? A seat or a part of the roof or?
For a long time, I had a seat, but I finally gave that up when we downsized our home and moved into a smaller place. But you are right. I mean, you can remember things where your contribution may have been major or minor, but it's because of a lot of people getting together and believing deeply on what it's going to take to move our community forward. And I was very fortunate. I had an opportunity to play a role for Bill Hudnut in causing that to happen.
I've said this before. It's actually one of the reasons why I wanted Louis Mahern and John Mutz to come on the podcast, Leaders and Legends podcast. They were wonderful. Is because a lot of people just don't know what John Mutz did for this city. And I'll pick him out because he obviously became lieutenant governor. But I also have thought that one of the most underrated contributors to the growth of Indianapolis is a fellow named Jim Dora Sr. How well did you know him? And what do you think his main contributions were to that critical period in the 80s and 90s as Indianapolis continued to mature?
Well, Jim Dora was a friend. In fact, where we lived before we downsized and moved into our condo here, was caused by my wife seeing the house that we ended up buying on the west side of Eagle Creek, just a couple doors down from Jim Dora. Jim played a critical role on the CIB. He was the communicator to the rest of the hotel industry because we really wanted to build a first-class convention tourism business. And Jim was the guy who carried the laboring oar in getting the hotel industry in support of raising taxes on them in order to accomplish this objective. And so it was a very sad day when we lost Jim.
He gave me more money for college through his wife's scholarship than anybody except Uncle Sam.
And he did it in a very quiet way. Most people did not know that he was supporting a scholarship at Purdue.
Absolutely.
He didn't want, I didn't know it, and I knew him well.
You mentioned, and these folks are obviously much, much better known, but you mentioned the Simons a few minutes ago. If the Simons don't buy the Pacers in, I think it's 83, 82, 83, 84, that time period. Thank you. Are they still here? Do you wonder? Do you think the Pacers go someplace else through some other purchase of another billionaire, millionaire, but the Simons stepping up years after the telethon to make sure that the Pacers are here?
Well, if they hadn't done it, Indianapolis would never have gotten the Colts. There's no question in my mind. We're very fortunate that Herb Simon, many people had approached Herb and Mel Simon, asking them to do it, and they always declined. The Pacers were on their way to Sacramento. Guy was buying the franchise and going to move it. Made no bones about it. It's the Sacramento now is the Kansas City franchise, and he ended up buying that one instead of the Pacers. But Ted Boehm, Jim Morris, and myself went to be with Herbie, and we said, and Bill Hudnut, and he said, you got to do it, Herb. And bless his heart, he said, I'll talk to Mel. And he talked to Mel, and the family stepped forward. Had they not done that, Indianapolis would be a very different place today.
In general, when you hear someone be critical of giving money to sports teams and why do we do all this when there are other critical needs and pressing problems facing the city, when the overall sort of sports tourism convention strategy kind of started by Lugar, of course, but really given turbocharged by Mayor Hudnut. When people criticize that, what's your response, rebuttal?
It's a question of spending a buck now that disappears versus spending a buck that creates a future. Looking at the sports as a athletic event is the wrong way, I think, to look at it for Indianapolis. What we were looking for is what are the economic engines that will drive this community? And one of those engines are businesses that their executives were elsewhere, but they had a plant here. And we needed to somehow get on the radar screen of those important decision makers who were making decisions about whether their plant was going to close or expand. And sports is a way of doing that. The conversations we have in our community on Monday morning after a Colts game or after a Pacer playoff give you an opportunity to connect with a bigger strategy we had, which was the strategy of using sports for economic development.
One of the best stories we've heard so far on the Leaders and Legends podcast, and we're here with David Frick, former deputy mayor for Bill Hudnut, is one told by Allison Millangton, which I'm going to try to get through without being weepy because I haven't been able to do it yet. Allison Millangton was CEO of the Super Bowl committee and left Super Bowl headquarters one night while the Super Bowl Village was activated and all that terrific attendance of people on Capitol and on Georgia Street. She goes, I just wanted to walk. I'd worked all day, worked all night. I just kind of wanted to walk and see what people were doing and talking about. So she walked from the headquarters, which was only about a block away, and then gets to Georgia Street. And then she sees in the distance this tall fella. And she continues to walk toward this man. She realizes it's Bill Hudnut. And as she goes up to talk to him, to say hello, she noticed Mayor Hudnut's crying. In the middle of all this activity, what do you think he was thinking as the tears were running down his cheek during the Super Bowl Village experience?
Oh, I think Bill was being reflective of the strategy that was adopted by the community and how that strategy finally played out and worked in the most prestigious way possible in having a Super Bowl, and how this community embraced, as it does all good sporting events, embraced that experience. And he was telling himself, we got it done. And I believe that's what he was saying.
In 34 years, Indianapolis went from having to host a telethon to save an NBA franchise to hosting a Super Bowl that completely redefined the experience for the entire league, therefore the entire country. Is that Bill Hudnut's legacy? Along with Mayor Peterson, along with Mayor Goldsmith, along with Mayor Ballard, and all the attendees, all the civic leaders and community leaders coming together, is that the culmination for you, or is there more to come?
Well, it was a good run. Today, things are just different. I'm not sure today you could have pulled off the things that we pulled off, because there was a lot of risk-taking associated with what Bill Hudnut and a lot of community leadership, both in the public sectors and the private sectors, could pull off. I don't know that it could be done today. The partisanship that has invaded the political arena makes it almost impossible to do what we did. I mean, think about it. Bill Crawford, one of the leading African-American leaders in this community, Louis Mahern, prominent Democrat, carried the legislation to build the Hoosier Dome. Well, people wouldn't do that today. Republicans and Democrats can't agree upon anything, and you attack your as opposed to working with people. So it was a great era. I mean, we got a lot done. I wish well the decision makers, because I think it's going to be tough to continue to do it.
We're getting ready to ask you the 5 questions that we finish every podcast with for all of our subjects. I want to mention one more name, which we would be remiss in not mentioning, and that's P.E. McAllister. His impact on this city, how would you describe it?
Well, P.E. was just so highly thought of in the business community and the governmental community. He was close to Dick Lugar. Dick Lugar gives him so much credit for what he has accomplished in both the business world as well as the governmental world. He's one of Bill Hudnut's closest advisors. They'd known each other for a number of years. And he clearly, because he never wanted the attention. So many people get in public life and want a lot of attention. He didn't. He was very quiet. And his leadership is a testament of how being not trying to take all the credit, but sharing the credit works and makes for a better place. And I wish he would be around for another 100, as he's 100 years down.
Amen to that. Leaders and legends, we ask the same 5 questions of every guest. So if you're ready.
I'm ready.
What was the first job you had?
Working on my grandparents' farm, shoveling crap.
In Northeast Indiana?
Yes. There's something unique that we've lost in America, and that is the good old family farm. I mean, it's all gone. And you sure grow up quickly when you have to get up at 5 a.m. and start your chores. And you can't go away for 2 days because the daggone cows need milking twice a day. So I think that was my first family job. My first summer job was one working for a consultant analyzing the infrastructure here in Indiana.
What was your first concert? Not one your parents dragged you to, but one you footed the bill for.
Oh my gosh. I never had enough money to go to concerts. I probably down at IU, there was some concert.
Greg Ballard's first concert was at IU, Sly and the Family Stone.
Got me. I couldn't. No way.
Did you like music? Do you do a lot of concerts when you were an adult, you and your wife?
No, we really haven't. We enjoy the symphony. We go both either the pops version or the classical version. We do it during the day. They've got a nice day program, but we don't follow. At least I don't. Well, neither one of us really have much interest in following music other than that.
If you could recommend one book to anyone, which book would you recommend?
There's so many great ones. I'm not sure I could answer that one book.
History book?
It would be something in history.
Do you have a particular figure with whom you would more closely identify?
I've read a lot about Lincoln. How he kept our country together. I wish we had him around again. So it would have been one of the series or one of the books probably involving Abraham Lincoln.
If you could witness any event in history, which event would you choose? Be there, see it happen, live.
I think I would have enjoyed watching the Yorktown battle, how it unfolded.
So October 19th, 1781, Washington and the French take on the British.
Trapped on the peninsula, the British. And how they led up to the fact of being able to confront them on terms favorable to the Americans. It would have been fun to sit in the strategy meetings. And
it was interesting. There was a famous naval battle right before the surrender called the Battle of the Capes, where the French defeated the British, and then the British can't rescue Cornwallis. How deferential the French general was to Washington, even though, he had all the experience and the French had the money, but he let Washington do his thing.
Well, you clearly have read more than I have, but the thing that I remember most is the talent that from Europe, some leading people in Europe had in coming over, and Pulaski is a good example of coming over and helping us in the battle, and how Franklin ever convinced the French to come help us.
There's a great book. It's called The Great Improvisation by Stacy Schiff. It's all about what you just said, Franklin convincing the Europeans to help us. Last question. If you could have dinner with anyone in the world right now living for a couple hours just to talk or reminisce, whom would you choose?
Well, I'm tempted to think in terms of historical figures or religious people. But given such a short time we have on this planet and the importance of family, I just like to be surrounded by my grandkids and my wife and my 2 kids, and just spend 2 wonderful hours with them.
You have been listening to Leaders and Legends, presented by Veteran Strategies and sponsored by the Girl Scouts of Indiana. My name is Robert Vane, and we have been honored to spend the last hour with David Frick. It's easy to list mayors and senators and governors and representatives as people who've made an impact on this city. But on the Mount Rushmore of people who have changed Indianapolis, David Frick's face is right there. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for listening to Leaders and Legends, brought to you by Veteran Strategies Incorporated. If you want to contact us about this program or our menu of public relations services, please send us an email at robert@veteranstrategies.com. That's robert@veteranstrategies.com.